The last apple pie. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's Market cast their harsh, artificial glow over the worn linoleum floors, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a hospital than a place where families came to buy groceries. David Martinez stood behind his twin daughters, Emma and Sophia, watching as they carefully placed their grandmother's homemade apple pie on the black conveyor belt. The pie, golden brown and still warm from the oven just hours ago, seemed almost out of place in the sterile environment of the checkout line. At 8 years old, the twins had insisted on carrying the pie themselves, their small hands gripping the ceramic dish with the kind of reverence usually reserved for precious artifacts. Their matching purple sweaters, knitted by their grandmother's arthritic fingers just last Christmas, hung loose on their thin frames. David noticed how much weight they'd both lost in recent months, how their once bright eyes now carried shadows that no child should bear. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, looked down at the pie with genuine curiosity. Her name tag read, Margaret, and she'd been working at Murphy's Market for over 15 years, long enough to recognize the Martinez family as regulars, though she'd noticed they'd been coming in less frequently lately. "That's a beautiful pie, girls," Margaret said softly, her voice carrying the gentle tone she reserved for children. "Did you make it yourselves?" Emma, always the more talkative of the twins, looked up with eyes that seemed too old for her young face. "Our abuela made it," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's her special apple pie with cinnamon and love." Sophia nodded solemnly beside her sister, her curly hair bouncing slightly with the movement. "She taught us the recipe," she added, her small voice breaking slightly on the words. "She said we need to remember it always." David felt his throat tighten as he listened to his daughters. Behind them, the usual sounds of the grocery store continued, the beeping of scanners, the rustle of plastic bags, the distant hum of refrigeration units, but everything felt muted, as if the world had somehow dimmed around them. Margaret's experienced eyes caught the subtle signs that something was amiss. She'd seen enough families over the years to recognize the particular kind of sadness that hung around the Martinez family like a heavy cloak. The way David's shoulders sagged with exhaustion, the careful way the girls handled the pie, the forced smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, it all spoke of a grief too deep for words. "Your grandmother must be a wonderful baker," Margaret said gently, not yet understanding the full weight of her words. The twins exchanged a look that spoke of shared sorrow and an understanding that went beyond their years. It was Emma who finally spoke, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to gather in her eyes. "She was," Emma said simply, and in those 2 words, Margaret understood. The pie wasn't just a pie. It was a memory, a final gift, a last connection to someone who would never again flour her hands or preheat her oven. Margaret had seen her share of grief in her years behind the register, but there was something particularly heartbreaking about watching 2 young children carry their grandmother's final creation with such careful devotion. David stepped forward, his hand gently touching Emma's shoulder. "Girls, why don't you help Margaret bag the other groceries?" he suggested, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to contain. As the twins carefully moved to help with the few other items they'd picked up, bread, milk, eggs, the basic necessities of a household trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, Margaret caught David's eye. In that brief moment of adult understanding, she saw the exhaustion of a man who was trying to hold his family together while processing his own grief. "I'm sorry for your loss," Margaret said quietly, her words meant only for David. He nodded, unable to trust his voice. His mother-in-law, Carmen Rodriguez, had been more than just the girl's grandmother. She'd been the heart of their family, the keeper of traditions, the one who made holidays special and ordinary days memorable. When his wife Maria had died in a car accident 2 years ago, Carmen had moved in to help raise the twins, becoming the maternal figure they desperately needed and the support system David couldn't provide alone. The cancer had taken her quickly, too quickly for any of them to properly prepare. One day she was teaching the girls how to braid their hair and the next she was in the hospital, her body finally succumbing to a disease that had been silently growing inside her for months. The pie they carried now had been her final project, completed despite her weakness, her way of ensuring that a piece of her would always be with them. She stayed up all night making it, David found himself saying, his voice barely audible. Even though she could barely stand. She said. He paused, swallowing hard. She said the girls needed to have one last pie, so they'd always remember how much she loved them. Margaret's own eyes filled with tears as she continued to scan their meager groceries. Bread, milk, eggs, the simple staples of survival when everything else felt too complicated to manage. She'd seen it before, families reduced to the basics while they navigated the impossible landscape of loss. Emma tugged on Margaret's sleeve, her small face serious and thoughtful. "Miss Margaret," she said, "would you like to know the secret ingredient?" Margaret crouched down to Emma's level, recognizing that this was important. "I'd love to know," she said. "Abuela always said the secret ingredient was love," Emma explained with the gravity of someone passing down sacred knowledge. "She said you have to think happy thoughts about the people who will eat it while you're making it. That's what makes it taste special." Sophia nodded in agreement. She thought happy thoughts about us for 3 whole hours while she made this one, she added. Even though she was very tired. The image of their grandmother, weak from treatment but determined to create one final expression of her love, hung heavy in the air. Margaret had to blink back tears as she imagined this woman, fighting against her own failing body to give her granddaughters something they could hold on to. "That sounds like a very wise woman," Margaret said softly. "She was the wisest," Emma agreed. "She knew everything about cooking and gardening and how to make us feel better when we were sad." "She knew all the best stories too," Sophia added. "Stories about when our mama was little, and stories about Mexico where she grew up, and stories about magical places where people never have to say goodbye." David watched his daughters talk about their grandmother, marveling at their resilience even as his own heart broke a little more. Children, he'd learned, processed grief differently than adults. They could speak about loss with a matter-of-fact acceptance that both amazed and devastated him. They missed their grandmother terribly, but they also carried her with them in ways that adults often struggled to do. Margaret finished scanning their items and began to bag them carefully, treating each simple purchase with the same care she'd shown the pie. As she worked, she found herself thinking about her own grandmother, gone now for over 20 years, and how the smell of her lavender sachets could still transport her back to childhood. "Where will you have the pie?" she asked gently, sensing that this wasn't just a grocery purchase but part of something larger. "We're going to eat it tonight," Emma explained. "Papa said we can eat it for dinner if we want, because it's a special day. It's our goodbye dinner," Sophia added with the stark honesty that only children possess. Papa says we need to say goodbye properly, and Abuela would want us to enjoy her pie. David's eyes met Margaret's over the girls' heads, and she saw the weight of single parenthood, of trying to navigate grief while helping two young children process their own loss. How do you explain death to 8-year-olds who've already lost their mother? How do you create closure for children who've experienced too much loss for their young lives? That sounds like a beautiful way to remember her, Margaret said, and she meant it. As she finished bagging their groceries, Margaret made a decision that went against store policy but felt absolutely right. She reached under her counter and pulled out a small container of vanilla ice cream from the employee refrigerator, her own lunch dessert that suddenly seemed insignificant in the face of what this family was enduring. For the pie, she said simply, placing it in their bag without scanning it. Apple pie is always better with ice cream. The gesture was small, but David's eyes filled with tears at this unexpected kindness from a stranger who had somehow understood the magnitude of their moment. In a world that had felt increasingly cold and disconnected since Carmen's death, Margaret's simple act of compassion felt like a small miracle. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, thank you, Miss Margaret," the twins chorused, their faces brightening slightly at the prospect of ice cream with their grandmother's pie. As they prepared to leave, Emma suddenly turned back to Margaret with the impulsive generosity that children sometimes display. "Miss Margaret, would you like to come have pie with us? Abuela always said food tastes better when you share it with friends." Margaret's heart clenched at the invitation, so pure and genuine despite coming from a child in the midst of grief. "That's very kind of you, sweetheart, but I need to stay here and help other people with their groceries. But I want you to know that when you eat that pie tonight, I'll be thinking about you and your grandmother. Will you think happy thoughts?" Sophia asked seriously. "Like the secret ingredient." "I will absolutely think happy thoughts," Margaret promised, and she meant it. As the Martinez family walked toward the exit, their few bags in hand and the precious pie carried between the twins, Margaret watched them go with a heavy heart. She'd encountered thousands of customers over her years at Murphy's Market, but she knew she'd remember this family long after they'd gone home to share their grandmother's final gift. The automatic doors slid open with their usual mechanical whoosh, and David and the girls stepped out into the parking lot where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour. As they loaded their groceries into David's aging Honda Civic, Emma looked up at her father with the kind of question that only children ask at the most unexpected moments. "Papa, do you think Abuela can see us eating her pie?" David paused in loading the trunk, considering how to answer. He wasn't a particularly religious man, but loss had a way of making people hope for things beyond the tangible world. "I think," he said carefully, "that love doesn't disappear just because someone isn't here anymore. I think maybe love finds ways to stay with us." "Like in the pie?" Sophia asked. "Exactly like in the pie," David agreed. The drive home was quiet, with the twins carefully monitoring the pie to ensure it remained level and intact. Their neighborhood, once vibrant with children playing and neighbors chatting over fence lines, now felt subdued in the way that familiar places do when viewed through the lens of loss. The house they pulled up to was small but well maintained, with Carmen's flower garden still blooming in the front yard despite the changing season. Inside, the kitchen still smelled faintly of Carmen's presence, a mixture of vanilla, cinnamon, and the particular scent of someone who spent their life nurturing others through food. Her apron still hung on its hook by the stove, and her recipe box sat on the counter, its worn index cards a testament to decades of family meals. David set the pie on the kitchen table while the girls put away their groceries with the kind of helpful efficiency that children develop when circumstances require them to grow up faster than they should. The kitchen table, scarred from years of family meals and homework sessions and craft projects, seemed like the perfect stage for their goodbye dinner. "Should we use the good plates?" Emma asked, referring to Carmen's china that was typically reserved for holidays and special occasions. David considered this. Carmen had always been saving the good china for special occasions that somehow never seemed special enough. Now, with her gone, he realized that every meal his daughters ate was precious, every moment they had together was worthy of the finest things they owned. "Yes," he said firmly. "Let's use Abuela's good plates." As they set the table with Carmen's delicate blue and white china, each piece a small work of art that she'd collected over the years, the girls shared memories of their grandmother. How she always wore her hair in a neat bun when she cooked. How she sang Mexican lullabies while she worked in the kitchen. How she never let them help with the sharp knives but always found ways for them to participate in meal preparation. Remember how she used to let us lick the spoon when she made frosting? Sophia said, carefully placing a fork beside her plate. And how she always made sure we ate vegetables by hiding them in things we liked, Emma added. I never knew there were zucchini in her chocolate muffins until she told me the secret. David smiled at this memory. Carmen had been a master at nutrition by stealth, finding ways to ensure the girls ate well without making mealtime a battle. She'd approach parenting and grandparenting with a combination of love, wisdom, and gentle cunning that had made her invaluable to their little family. When the table was set and the pie placed in the center like a centerpiece, they stood around it for a moment in silence. The pie looked smaller somehow, sitting on the large kitchen table, but it seemed to radiate warmth and love in a way that filled the entire room. Should we say something? Emma asked, looking between her father and sister with uncertainty. David realized that this was his responsibility, this moment of creating closure and meaning for his daughters. He wasn't sure how to do it. There was no handbook for helping children say goodbye to beloved grandmothers, but he knew it needed to be genuine and from the heart. Abuela Carmen, he began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Thank you for this beautiful pie, and thank you for teaching our girls about love and kindness and the importance of taking care of each other. We promise to remember everything you taught us, and we promise to share your recipes and your stories with others, just like you would have wanted. And thank you for the secret ingredient, Emma added solemnly. And for always making us feel safe, Sophia contributed. They cut the pie carefully, each slice revealing the perfect layers of tender apples, fragrant cinnamon, and flaky crust that Carmen had perfected over decades of baking. The first bite was a revelation, not just of flavor, but of memory. It tasted like Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations, like comfort after nightmares and rewards for good report cards. As they ate, the girls shared more memories, their voices growing lighter as they remembered the joy their grandmother had brought to their lives rather than focusing solely on the sadness of her absence. They talked about the time she'd taught them to dance salsa in the living room, and how she'd helped them build elaborate blanket forts on rainy days, and the way she'd always have fresh cookies waiting when they came home from school. Margaret's gift of ice cream proved to be the perfect complement to the pie, its cool sweetness balancing the warm spices in a way that seemed almost magical. As they ate, David found himself thinking about the kindness of strangers, about how a simple gesture from someone they'd never see again had made this difficult evening a little bit easier. "Papa," Sophia said suddenly, her spoon halfway to her mouth, "I think Miss Margaret has the secret ingredient too." "What do you mean, Mija?" David asked. "She was thinking happy thoughts about us when she gave us the ice cream," Sophia explained with the clear logic of childhood. Just like Abuela did with the pie. David realized his daughter was right. Margaret's unexpected kindness had indeed been an expression of love. Not the deep, abiding love of family, but the broader love of human compassion, the recognition that we are all connected in our joys and sorrows. As the evening wore on and the pie disappeared slice by slice, the kitchen filled with something that had been absent since Carmen's death: laughter. Not the forced cheerfulness that adults sometimes impose on sad situations, but genuine, spontaneous joy as the girls remembered their grandmother's sense of humor, her silly jokes, her ability to find wonder in ordinary moments. "She would have loved this," Emma said as she finished her second piece of pie. "She would have told us we were eating too much dessert for dinner," Sophia added with a giggle. "And then she would have had another piece herself," David said, remembering Carmen's own sweet tooth and her philosophy that life was too short to skip dessert. As they cleaned up the dishes, using Carmen's good china one more time before carefully washing and putting it away, David realized that something had shifted. The crushing weight of grief was still there, would probably always be there in some form, but it had been joined by something else: the recognition that love persists beyond loss, that the people who matter most to us continue to nourish us even after they're gone. The last piece of pie sat on the counter, carefully covered with plastic wrap. "We should save it," Emma said, echoing what David was thinking. "For what?" Sophia asked. "For tomorrow," Emma explained. "So we can have a little bit more of Abuela with breakfast." And so they did. The next morning, as autumn sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, they shared the final piece of Carmen Rodriguez's last apple pie, eating it slowly and savoring every bite. It was a small ritual, but it felt significant, a way of extending their goodbye, of making their grandmother's love last just a little bit longer. In the weeks that followed, David and the girls would return to Murphy's Market for their regular grocery shopping. Margaret would always greet them warmly, asking about school and soccer practice and the small details of their lives that showed she remembered them. Sometimes she'd slip a small treat into their bag, a piece of candy for the girls, or a packet of hot cocoa for David, continuing her small acts of kindness in the way that some people naturally do. The girls eventually learned to make their grandmother's apple pie themselves, standing on chairs to reach the counter, their small hands learning to work with flour and butter and love. Their first attempts were imperfect. Crusts too thick or too thin, apples cut unevenly, spices not quite balanced. But they carried the essence of what Carmen had taught them. That food made with love tastes different, that cooking is an act of care, that recipes are really just excuses to create memories. David would sometimes find them in the kitchen on weekend mornings, flour in their hair and determination on their faces, trying to recreate not just their grandmother's pie but the feeling of being surrounded by her love. He'd help when asked, but mostly he'd watch from the doorway, marveling at how they'd internalized Carmen's lessons about patience and attention to detail. The secret ingredient, Emma would remind Sophia when her sister got frustrated with a stubborn pie crust, is thinking happy thoughts. And Sophia would close her eyes for a moment, presumably filling her mind with happiness, before returning to her work with renewed focus. Months later, when the first anniversary of Carmen's death arrived, they knew exactly how they wanted to mark the occasion. They made 3 apple pies, one for themselves, one to take to Carmen's grave, and one to give to Margaret at Murphy's Market. It felt like the right way to honor someone who had spent her life nurturing others, by continuing her tradition of expressing love through food. Margaret was working her usual shift when they arrived with their gift, the pie still warm from the oven and carefully transported in Carmen's old pie carrier. When Emma and Sophia presented it to her, explaining that it was made with the secret ingredient she'd learned about that day months ago, Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure you want to give this to me?" she asked, understanding the significance of the gesture. "Abuela always said food tastes better when you share it," Sophia explained seriously. "And you're our friend," Emma added. "Friends share pie." Margaret accepted the pie with the reverence it deserved, knowing that she was receiving more than just a dessert. She was being given a piece of a family's love, a continuation of a tradition that connected past and present and future. That evening, Margaret took the pie home to her own family, telling them the story of the Martinez family and their grandmother's final gift. As they ate it together around their own kitchen table, she thought about the mysterious ways that love travels through the world, how acts of kindness create ripples that extend far beyond their initial impact. The pie was delicious. Not perfect, perhaps, but made with the unmistakable flavor of love and memory and hope. And in that way, Carmen Rodriguez's legacy continued, touching the lives of people she'd never met, nourishing them not just with food but with the reminder that we are all connected, that kindness matters, that love persists. As the years passed, Emma and Sophia would continue to make their grandmother's apple pie, the recipe becoming more than just instructions for combining ingredients. It became a ritual of remembrance, a way of keeping Carmen present in their lives, a tangible connection to the woman who had taught them that cooking was just another word for loving. They would share pies with neighbors and teachers and new friends, always passing along the story of the secret ingredient, always emphasizing that the most important part of any recipe was the love that went into it. And in this way, Carmen's wisdom spread, one pie at a time, one act of kindness leading to another. David would eventually learn to make the pie himself, though he never quite mastered Carmen's technique with the crust. But his daughters didn't mind. They understood that love came in many forms, that their father's slightly imperfect pies were just as meaningful as their grandmother's masterpieces because they were made with the same essential ingredient, the desire to nurture and comfort and show care. The kitchen in their small house would eventually see many more pies, birthday cakes, holiday cookies, and ordinary Tuesday night dinners. But nothing would ever quite match the significance of that last apple pie, that final gift that taught them all about the persistence of love, the importance of kindness, and the way that food can carry memories and emotions and connections that last long after the last crumb is eaten. And sometimes, when the autumn air carried the scent of cinnamon and apples, when the light in the kitchen fell just right, David could almost imagine Carmen standing at the counter, her hands dusted with flour, her voice humming a half-remembered lullaby, still taking care of them in all the ways that matter most. The pie was gone, but the love remained. And in the end, that's what mattered most.